20 January 1943. The Pacific before dawn. A low ceiling of cloud presses down on black water, and beneath it a steel hull slips forward without a ripple. Inside the submarine, the air is thick with oil, sweat, and recycled breath. Condensation beads along coal pipes. A single red bulb flickers as the boat steadies its depth. Somewhere forward, a metal coffee mug rattles faintly against the bulkhead. Its contents still warm, still steaming. Defying the cold pressure of the ocean above, this moment matters because the balance of the Pacific War, still uncertain in early 1943, rested not only on carriers and island airstrips, but on unseen corridors of supply. Japan's empire stretched thousands of miles across ocean, sustained by merchant shipping that moved oil, food, troops, and ammunition from conquered territories to the home islands. These ships were not glamorous. They did not carry admirals or headlines. But without them, the Japanese Navy would starve in place. The United States submarine force entered the war unprepared, plagued by faulty torpedoes, rigid doctrine, and commanders trained more for caution than aggression. Early patrols produced little to show for the risk. Japanese naval leadership, reviewing reports in late 1942, concluded that American submarines were inefficient, overly cautious, and technically unreliable. Their expectation was clear. Submarines were a nuisance, not a decisive threat. They were wrong. The boat cutting through the Pacific darkness that January was USS Wahoo. Its captain, Dudley Mush Morton, had already abandoned the habits that defined the early submarine war. He believed speed, aggression, and initiative mattered more than textbook positioning. His executive officer, Richard O'Kane, kept meticulous records measuring angles, speeds, and distances with relentless precision. Together, they represented a shift in American naval thinking from restraint to calculated audacity. Japanese escort crews, trained to expect cautious attacks from long range, believed they understood submarine behavior. They expected torpedoes fired at maximum distance, shallow running depths, and immediate withdrawal. What they encountered instead was a predator willing to close the distance, attack inside defensive screens, and remain in the kill zone long enough to confirm destruction. On January 26, 1943, Wahoo made contact with a Japanese convoy moving through the Solomon Sea. The merchant ship sailed in disciplined columns, escorted by destroyers whose crews trusted their sonar and depth charges. They had reason to. Until then, few American submarines had dared approach so closely. Inside Wahoo, the coffee mug was passed from hand to hand as final calculations were made. Not as comfort, but as habit. Routine under pressure. American sailors drank coffee not because it was ceremonial, but because it was there available, abundant, unremarkable. That abundance followed them even into combat, a quiet contrast to the tightening shortages already beginning to affect Japanese crews. The first attack came from close range. Torpedoes struck with violent certainty. A transport ship shuddered, then broke apart, its cargo spilling into black water. Escorts reacted too late. Depth charges followed, but the submarine slipped beneath them, maneuvering aggressively instead of retreating. Within hours, another ship was hit. Then another. Japanese after-action reports from that week revealed confusion. Commanders noted torpedoes arriving from unexpected angles, attack patterns inconsistent with known doctrine, and a submarine that appeared to disregard its own safety. One report described the enemy commander as reckless to the point of disbelief. Another questioned whether multiple submarines were operating in coordination. There was only one. Over 4 days, Wahoo sank 5 ships, transports, cargo vessels, ships carrying the lifeblood of an empire already stretched thin. The cumulative tonnage was staggering for a single patrol. More unsettling than the losses themselves was the manner in which they occurred. The attacks were not cautious probes. They were deliberate, repeated strikes delivered with confidence. Japanese sailors expected an opponent bound by rules. They encountered one guided by results. As the days passed, word spread through Japanese naval channels. A single American submarine had operated with impunity, slipping through escorts, surviving counterattacks, and striking again and again. The belief that American submarines lacked effectiveness began to erode. In its place grew something more dangerous - uncertainty. Inside Wahoo, the routine continued. Engines hummed. Men rotated through watches. Coffee was brewed again and again, its smell cutting through diesel and sweat. It was not luxury. It was continuity. It reminded the crew that even here, in the depths, their system worked. Supplies flowed. Equipment functioned. Doctrine adapted. This was not merely a tactical success. It was ideological. The Japanese Navy had been built on precision, hierarchy, and the assumption that spirit could overcome material disadvantage. But submarines attacked logistics, not honor. They turned abundance into a weapon. Every ship sunk represented fuel never burned, aircraft never launched, soldiers never fed. By the end of January, Japanese planners quietly revised their assessments. Submarine threat levels were raised. Escort requirements increased. Shipping routes were altered. Each change consumed resources Japan could ill afford to spare. The shock was not loud. It did not explode across headlines. It crept into memoranda and revised procedures. It settled into the awareness that the sea itself had become hostile. And beneath that sea, Wahoo continued onward, its hull scarred, its crew exhausted, its coffee mug still warm in a hand steady enough to guide steel through darkness. As Wahoo slipped away from the wreckage fields it had created, the Pacific resumed its surface calm, betraying nothing of what had just occurred beneath. Oil spread thinly across the water, reflecting dawn light in broken colors, while debris drifted eastward with the current. For Japanese lookouts scanning the horizon hours later, the sea appeared empty, obedient, unchanged. But absence itself had become evidence. In naval headquarters far from the sinking sites, the losses were compiled with increasing urgency. 5 ships in 4 days, attributed to a single American submarine operating with unusual boldness. These were not marginal vessels or expendable hulks. They carried fuel from the Dutch East Indies, food from Southeast Asia, equipment intended for contested island chains. Each ship represented months of planning, precious steel, and trained crews Japan could not replace quickly. The Imperial Navy had always understood logistics in theory. Now it was learning their fragility in practice. Japanese escort doctrine emphasized layered defense, predictable convoy movement, and reactive counterattack. The expectation was that submarines would strike once and flee, allowing destroyers to saturate likely escape routes with depth charges. What Wahoo demonstrated instead was a refusal to disengage. It attacked from inside escort screens, repositioned rapidly, and returned again before defenders could reestablish order. This was not recklessness. It was an exploitation of enemy expectation. American submarine doctrine was evolving in real time. After months of frustration, missed shots, malfunctioning torpedoes, conservative patrols commanders like Morton began discarding inherited caution. War Patrol reports from late 1942 and early 1943 show a sharp increase in aggressive maneuvering, closer firing distances, and repeated attacks on single convoys. The data was unmistakable. Success correlated not with distance, but with audacity. Inside Wahoo, the atmosphere grew quieter as the patrol continued. Not from fear, but from focus. Each man understood that survival now depended on momentum. The boat could not rely on stealth alone. It relied on unpredictability. Engines were pushed harder. Batteries drained deeper. Risks were accepted consciously, measured against opportunity. The coffee mug reappeared at regular intervals. It was dented now, its enamel chipped from repeated collisions with steel walls during evasive maneuvers. Yet it endured, filled and refilled from ample stores. For the crew, it symbolized more than comfort. It represented continuity of supply. Somewhere beyond the horizon, factories still ran, convoys still sailed, systems still functioned. The submarine was not alone. It was an extension of a nation that could afford to sustain it. Japanese sailors, by contrast, began to feel the tightening margins. Fuel conservation measures were introduced quietly. Escort commanders were instructed to limit high-speed maneuvers except when absolutely necessary. Training exercises emphasized caution, listening, endurance. These adjustments were sensible, but they carried costs. Escorts spent more time defending and less time moving. Convoys slowed. Schedules slipped. Reports from Japanese merchant captains during this period reveal a shift in tone. Where earlier entries spoke confidently of routine voyages, later ones mentioned tension, constant alertness, the strain of prolonged vigilance. The sea, once regarded as familiar territory, had become a source of unease. Every periscope feather, every unexplained wake suggested threat. American Submarine Command took notice. Fleet communications circulated summaries of Wahoo's patrol, highlighting its effectiveness and the tactical principles behind it. Aggression was no longer framed as deviation, but as doctrine. Younger captains absorbed the lesson quickly. The submarine war was entering its decisive phase. On the fourth day, after the fifth sinking, Wahoo finally withdrew from the area. Not because danger had passed, but because opportunity had been exhausted. Torpedoes were limited. Batteries required recharge. The boat slipped into deeper water, evading pursuit with practiced calm. Depth charges exploded above, distant and unfocused, thrown more in frustration than precision. Japanese escorts recorded no confirmed kill. Instead, they reported loss of contact, ambiguous sonar returns, and fuel depletion. These were the quiet markers of defeat. The submarine had not merely escaped. It had imposed exhaustion. As Wahoo turned toward open sea, the crew settled into routine again. Damage was assessed. Systems checked. Coffee brewed. The mug rested briefly on a chart table, steady now as if acknowledging a temporary lull. No celebration followed. There was work yet to be done. The psychological impact of the patrol extended far beyond its immediate aftermath. Japanese planners began reallocating destroyers from offensive operations to convoy escort. This decision, made incrementally, weakened Japan's ability to project naval power elsewhere. Every escort tied to merchant protection was one less available for fleet engagements. Island reinforcement. American submarines multiplied. What had been an anomaly became pattern. The Pacific, vast and once permissive, grew increasingly lethal for Japanese shipping. The shock delivered by Wahoo was not isolated. It was the opening note of a sustained campaign. And beneath it all ran a deeper transformation. The realization that modern war could be decided not by decisive battles alone, but by attrition applied invisibly, relentlessly, without ceremony. Submarines did not seek honor. They sought effect. As night fell again over the Pacific, Wahoo ran surface for a time, diesel engines churning, air freshening inside the hull. Stars appeared overhead, indifferent and distant. The coffee mug was set down once more, steam rising faintly into recycled air. It was an ordinary object, unremarkable in any other context. Here, it carried weight. Because it represented what the Japanese Navy increasingly lacked: margin, the ability to absorb loss without collapse, the freedom to adapt faster than the enemy, abundance not merely of material, but of choice. The sea did not change, but control of it was slipping, one ship at a time. By the time Wahoo returned to base, the numbers alone no longer told the full story. Tonnage sunk could be calculated. Dates could be logged. But the disturbance created by that patrol traveled faster than paperwork. It moved through briefings, whispered assessments, and revised assumptions. The Japanese Navy had not merely lost ships. It had lost certainty. In Tokyo, naval analysts reviewed convoy losses against escort deployment charts. The pattern emerging in early 1943 unsettled them. American submarines were no longer striking opportunistically. They were hunting deliberately. More troubling still, their attacks showed evidence of learning. Firing solutions improved. Close-range engagements increased. Survivability rates rose. These were signs not of desperation, but of maturation. The Imperial Japanese Navy had once prided itself on technical excellence and spiritual resolve. Yet its anti-submarine warfare capabilities lagged behind those of its opponents. Sonar technology was inconsistent. Depth charge patterns were rigid. Training emphasized bravery over adaptation. Against a cautious enemy, these weaknesses could be concealed. Against an aggressive one, they were exposed. The success of Wahoo accelerated internal debate within the U.S. Navy. For months, submarine commanders had complained about defective torpedoes, premature detonations, deep running, failure to explode. Bureaucratic resistance had slow corrective action. Now, undeniable results from aggressive patrols forced acknowledgement. Field commanders were not merely reckless. They were right. Technical reviews followed. Torpedo depth settings were re-examined. Magnetic exploders were modified, then quietly abandoned in favor of contact detonators. Each fix multiplied effectiveness. The American submarine force was shedding its early war limitations and becoming something else entirely, a system capable of sustained cumulative destruction. For Japanese merchant sailors, the change was immediate and personal. Voyages that once felt routine now carried an undercurrent of dread. Convoy formations tightened. Lookouts were doubled. Engines ran at uneven speeds to complicate targeting. Yet none of these measures restored confidence. The sea had begun to feel watched. The expectation among Japanese crews had been straightforward. Submarines were dangerous, but manageable. Escorts existed to protect them. The Empire's reach would hold. Instead, they encountered an enemy willing to accept risk, to press attacks repeatedly, to operate where doctrine said it should not. The shock lay not in the violence itself, but in its persistence. American submariners, meanwhile, internalized a different lesson. They learned that initiative mattered, that waiting for perfect conditions meant missed opportunities, that aggression, when disciplined, reduced danger rather than increasing it. Patrol reports from 1943 show commanders explicitly referencing earlier successes, adapting tactics observed from boats like Wahoo. The coffee mug continued its quiet journey from patrol to patrol. It appeared in after-action photographs, perched incongruously beside charts and periscopes. It was not symbolic by design. It simply endured. Its presence reflected something structural. The United States could supply not only weapons, but routine. Even at sea, even submerged, normalcy followed. Japanese logistics officers began issuing warnings. Fuel reserves were tighter than anticipated. Replacement shipping lagged behind losses. New hulls took time. Crews took longer. Meanwhile, submarines required fewer resources to maintain pressure. A single boat could disrupt dozens of voyages over months. This asymmetry favored the attacker. By mid-1943, Japanese convoy losses climbed sharply. Submarine contacts increased across the Pacific theater. What had begun as isolated incidents became a campaign. The psychological impact compounded. Sailors grew fatigued. Escorts grew cautious. Convoys slowed further, exposing themselves longer. The transformation was subtle but decisive. The Japanese Navy, built to win a climactic fleet engagement, found itself fighting an invisible war of attrition it had not prepared for. Its ships were designed for battle, not survival under constant harassment. Its doctrine prized decisive action, not prolonged defense. American strategy, by contrast, embraced accumulation. There would be no single decisive submarine battle. There would be pressure, applied continuously until the system failed. Submarines were not heroic lone wolves in this conception. They were instruments of inevitability. As Wahoo's example spread, so did its consequences. Japanese destroyers burned fuel at unsustainable rates. Crews trained harder but learned slower. Industrial output strained under competing demands. Each adjustment addressed symptoms, not cause. The sea lanes began to thin, and through it all, beneath layers of steel and water, American submarines continued their patrols. Watches changed. Charts were marked. Coffee was poured. The mug, dented and stained, moved from hand to hand without ceremony. It was a small thing, but it represented the difference between improvisation born of necessity and routine, sustained by abundance. The Japanese Navy had expected harassment. It encountered erosion. It expected rules. It faced adaptation. And slowly, inexorably, it began to understand that the war beneath the waves would not be won by courage alone, that it would be lost by depletion,